Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022-2023 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series, Confronting Empire, a year-long series on U.S. imperialism and anti-imperialism that looks at U.S. empire from the roots as a settler colonial state to overseas expansion to the wars of the 21st century. I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now! It is such an honor to be with all of you today. Tonight's program is presented by the UMass Amherst History Department in collaboration with the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. More than 36 university and community partners have co-sponsored this year's series. I invite you to take a look at the chat for the full list. This biennial series is made possible thanks to Kenneth R. Feinberg and Associates. We're broadcasting from the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pocumtuck Nation on the land of Norwotug community, and made possible through the Morrill Land Grant Act, which sold portions of land from 82 Native nations to fund the building of land-grant universities, including UMass Amherst. For Spanish interpretation, please select the globe icon and select Spanish. To listen to the entire event in English, select English Live. Closed captions in English are also available. So to begin tonight, we're going to be hearing from two remarkable people. We'll be joined by the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Rigoberta Menchú Tum. We'll also be joined by the American author, journalist with the Los Angeles Times, and then with the Financial Times and the Washington Post, Vincent Bevins. I'll be introducing him more fully later, but I thought we'd start with the trailer of the film, When the Mountains Tremble.
If Guatemala came unstuck, it would have serious economic repercussions throughout Central America.
We must continue to encourage peace among the nations of Central America. No amount of reform will bring peace so long as guerrillas believe they will win by force.
The government of the United States is not going to permit a red Soviet republic between Texas and the Panama Canal.
Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú, indígena quiché del pueblo de Guatemala. Soy campesina, soy cristiana, soy un sobreviviente de mi familia. Les voy a contar mi historia, que es la historia de todo el pueblo de Guatemala.
The pressure of the mass movement for change and the inflexibility of the military brought the country to a tension that was unbearable.
El resto es historia.
And there you saw our keynote presenter, Dr. Rigoberta Menchú Tum, in the film When the Mountains Tremble by the remarkable filmmaker Pamela Yates. And I encourage everyone to watch that whole film, but not right now, because you have the woman in the flesh before you to tell her life story. Yes, Dr. Rigoberta Menchú has been such an inspiration for me for so many decades. She participated in the farm worker movement in Guatemala as a young woman. Her seminal testimonial, her book, I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian Woman in Guatemala, denounced President Reagan's support for government attacks on Mayan communities. Over 150,000 indigenous people were killed by the US-backed Guatemalan forces in the 1980s. Rigoberta Menchú, in her incredibly brave work as she stood up to power, won her the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. Right now, Dr. Menchú Tum is going to present a speech, and then we're going to hear from Vincent Bevins, an American journalist who has written about Indonesia, Brazil, and so much more. And then we're going to have a conversation and invite you to join and ask questions. But first, it is my honor to present Dr. Rigoberta Menchú Tum.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here with you today. I am Rigoberta Menchú Tum. I am an activist, a social activist, and I think that's the title, the most important title that I have, because I was born in the struggle from the resiliency of the indigenous people, from the vindication of human rights, the right to live. And I'm part of a country that always lived, and that lived plain in the Cold War, during the Cold War. And I think from the Condor Plan, many people were killed. Some groups, extreme groups, were reinforced, above all right-wing extremists, and they made a lot of plans to kill people. And I think Guatemala wasn't only victim of a plan against insurgents, but it was a plan that involved the killing of a lot of people, of a lot of communities, and that especially targeted social organizers, women who were fighting, peasants who were fighting, and women, because women were participating in these movements, above all Mayan women. And I think within my story, there's a lot to tell, but I think the most important thing probably is that I didn't shut up. I didn't go silent. I broke the silence. Breaking the silence in those years was very risky, but I had to break that silence. And that silence brought about the killing of my father, who was burnt alive in the Spanish embassy in the 80s. My mom was kidnapped, and I don't know what happened to her. I don't know where my mom is, where her remains are, where does her body lie. I also lost my brothers Victor and Patrocinio, many other members of my family. But my story is also a story that I could use to vindicate the memory, the collective memory of the indigenous peoples. And that's why I'm so thankful to this program of the University of Massachusetts. I'm thankful that it brings history to the young people. I think history belongs to us, the generations who were protagonists, but it also belongs to the young people who are going to be living in the future. We can't improve the future if we don't have a historic memory. We need that historic memory. And thanks to Pamela Yates, who made the film When the Mountains Tremble, and thanks to other people who helped construct the book, I am Rigoberta Menchú, and that's how my consciousness was born. And also to all the people who gave me and have given me the opportunity to speak and to speak my pain and to become the leader that I am. And that's why I think that time will be the judge of it all. There were many policies of terror in Latin America, support policies that were supported by the United States. Leaders like Kissinger, like Reagan, from the intervention of year 54 in Guatemala, we've been influenced by North American politics. At that time, everybody believed that we were anti-American, but we weren't anti-American. We were only criticizing, and we were trying to visualize or visibilize the policies that were hurting us in the framework, within the framework of the Cold War, and how those interventions resulted in the death of many people. And I think the most important thing from all of this experience is the participation of women, what we did and how we managed to bring to trial many of these issues. It's very important to see how some of the trials that happened because of these killings, that we were able to bring forth evidence of those killings, of those horrors, and also how those trials brought forth the testimony and brought peace and justice to some of the other events of that time, some of the other killings, some of the other injustices. This is a struggle that took many years, that took decades, but we went to trial, we went to the court, and we made those things happen, and we wrote that historic memory, because we don't want the young ones, the young people, to go through that again, to commit those crimes again. And we also want to leave written testimony of the history and the stories of these peoples. We want to make a legitimate narrative. And here we continue this work, constructing, building democracy. We're writing the stories of the armed conflict in Guatemala, of the Cold War, something that left us divided, that left us with a lot of pain, that left the footprints of violence. And that's why with the Nobel Prize, I fought and I struggled, and I wanted to bring respect for life, education, justice, peace. It wasn't only about voicing, well, this is what happened during the war. What I wanted to do was to bring forth the voices of the people and help them construct a compromise of peace as mutual respect. And I think we've come a long way. And I think we have to leave history to the new generations to come. We've settled some principles of struggle against violence. We've set some principles, some footprints for human dignity. We're living history written in many different ways, verbal, written, in academic circles, but I want to congratulate what you're doing in academic and university circles, because having history of Britain is very important. So I really congratulate you for this space. I congratulate the students who are part of this, the professors, Diana Sierra, Jess Johnson. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Amy Goodman, who's our conductor today, our presenter. Also, Vincent, I look forward to hearing what you have to say about the history of Latin America. We've lived it. We lived it in our own skin, but we continue. We're still here. I am a leader. I am a woman. But when I look to the past, I don't seek revenge. I love life. I want to lead a life that is free and that is spiritually full. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rigoberta Menchú. And I have so many questions I want to ask you, as I'm sure so many hundreds of people in the audience do as well. But first, we're going to also hear from Vincent Bevins, an American journalist and writer. From 2011 to 2016, he worked as a foreign correspondent based in Brazil for the Los Angeles Times, after working previously in London for the Financial Times. In 2017, he moved to Jakarta, Indonesia, and began covering Southeast Asia from there, and then began his book in 2018. He was writing for the Washington Post, The Jakarta Method, Washington's anti-communist crusade and the mass murder program that shaped our world. The book about Cold War violence in Indonesia and Latin America, his work mostly focusing on international politics, the world economy, and global culture. Vincent Bevins, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to speak after Rigoberta, and hope I can do my best to provide some of this context that I was discovered working on this book, The Jakarta Method. But since this is a series about imperialism, I want to quickly note that unlike what I was taught in high school, U.S. imperialism did not begin in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. It was not a phase that started late in U.S. history. It started in 1776 with the very foundation of the United States. Imperialism started in North America. The vast majority of what is now the United States was conquered, not by the British Empire, but the United States government. I'm sure other speakers in the series have covered that very well. I always like to push back against what I was told as a child. But since I will be talking primarily about the second half of the 20th century, or more specifically about Jakarta, this metonym, this real life literary device that connects cases of mass murder all around the world, I think it makes sense to really start in 1945 with the end of World War II. A moment in history at which I think it is useful to divide the world into three parts, as was common at the time. You had the First World, which was the rich and powerful countries of the North Atlantic and their allies. All of these countries had become rich during periods in which they practiced overseas imperialism. You had the Second World, which was the countries of the formerly communist world led by Moscow, and the countries that were either liberated or conquered by the Red Army, depending on how you want to look at it, during World War II. And then you had the rest of humanity, the so-called Third World. And though this has been forgotten since, the Third World at the time was an entirely optimistic, forward-looking, idealistic project which sought to reformulate the rules of the global economy, which sought to put the peoples of the Third World alongside the First World in what was believed to be their rightful place and what was believed to be their natural destination after the end of formal European colonization of the countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, at this time, at the end of World War II, the United States emerges as by far the most powerful country in human history. It is now the leader of the first world, and this is a pretty quick transformation for a relatively young country. The United States emerges onto the global scene with far more power than the countries of Western Europe that had formerly colonized much of the globe, far more power than the second world led in Moscow, and much more power, of course, than the countries of the third world. Now, unlike the British Empire, the United States did not have a clandestine service that was tasked with collecting information around the world and generating outcomes and intervening throughout the globe in order to create conditions which were favorable to the United States. There was no MI6 in the history of the United States government. But in 1945, the United States does create the CIA, officially to collect information to be delivered to the president, but then which also begins to act covertly to shape outcomes around the world in accordance with the perceived interests of the United States government. Now, at the very beginning, the CIA was supposed to take on the second world. The problem with that was that they repeatedly failed. When they tried to actually get behind the so-called Iron Curtain, when they tried to penetrate into areas controlled by Moscow and its allies, they failed repeatedly, sent many men to their deaths, and basically came up against that very Iron Curtain. And so they turned to the third world. And even the most sympathetic biographers of the early members of the CIA, even the most sympathetic historians of the CIA admit that the men at the in charge of the CIA didn't really know much about the Global South at all. They turned to the Global South, or at the time the Third World, not knowing much about it and not knowing how to interact with it. And even third world leaders that were on the radical left, even men like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Mao Zedong in China, they did not know either how the United States was going to interact with the third world. It was Ho Chi Minh and Mao both hoped that the United States would form some kind of a friendship with them. In general, the countries of the Global South, including those led by communist leaders, did not want to pick a fight with the United States. They hoped that the United States would stay true to its professed Republican revolutionary ideals, Republican with a small r, rather than fall back into the practices that had been so integral to its expansion in North America, that is imperialism. So this was not clear in 1947, 1948, even to communist leaders. Now, no country better exemplifies this ambiguity, this uncertainty at the heart of US foreign policy towards the Global South, better than Indonesia, which is now the fourth largest country in the world by population, the world's largest Muslim majority country, and a nation which spans across 13, 15, 17, 19,000 islands, depending on how you want to count it, in the territory that used to be controlled by Dutch imperialism in Southeast Asia. And when this country was founded through the anti-colonial struggle against the Netherlands, the United States appeared to believe, the United States believed at the very beginning of what became the Cold War, that Indonesia could be an ally. Indonesia had expelled the Dutch in a revolutionary war. Communists existed, but they had been suppressed in that revolutionary process. And something called the Jakarta Axiom at the time in the early Cold War essentially stated that countries like this, countries that stayed neutral, that were not at risk of an immediate communist takeover, that did not want to be direct allies with the United States, but also were not allied directly with the Soviet Union, could be acceptable friends of the United States in the second half of the 20th century. Now, I said earlier that the CIA had wasted a lot of time and money and human lives trying to break into, mess with, screw up things in the second world. But by 1953, things change for the CIA. They get their first victory from their perspective. They succeed in making a coup happen in Iran, partially at the behest of the British, partially to stop a supposed communist the supposed possibility that there could be a communist takeover in the country, And as is often the case in US foreign policy, oil was a big part of the reason the United States got involved in Iran. Now, this was seen as a big victory in the White House. President Eisenhower, who had just taken over, thought that he had sort of discovered the cheat code to geopolitics. You don't have to send any men to die in a war. We've engineered an outcome in Iran at basically no cost to the United States. In the US, at least, the media is not really telling people about it. People certainly know in Iran, people know in Indonesia, people know across Latin America, but it seems to be this could be a way to go. We engineer coups in the global South to shape outcomes in accordance with our perceived interests. Then next comes Guatemala, another US-backed coup. And this is important for my purposes because this is the first point in the Cold War that I found that the US directs the local government to carry out the intentional mass murder of communists or people that are accused of being communists. This happens right after the 1954 coup in Guatemala. Now, that Jakarta axiom that I briefly described is now out the door. The idea that neutral countries can be tolerated is gone by 1953 and 54. The new policy coming from the White House is either you're with us or you're against us. If you're not specifically explicitly allied with the United States, you will be marked for possible elimination if it is convenient to us. Now, US policy towards Indonesia changes in 1955 for two reasons. One, Indonesia hosts the Bandung Conference, which is the first formal instantiation of the Third World Movement, bringing together representatives of about half the world's population, really putting into practice the idea that the world should be reformulated along the lines of real decolonization rather than just formal decolonization. And then the Indonesian Communist Party starts to do better and better in elections. And we know now from declassified documents that even the CIA and MI6 knew that this was a moderate, unarmed socialist party that had no intention of carrying out a revolution in the near future, and that was winning more votes because they were simply convincing people to vote for them. We know that by 1958, the CIA and MI6 knew that the Indonesian Communist Party would have won free and fair elections had they been allowed to take place. But they did not, because starting in 1955, the United States begins a series of attempts to derail the version of Indonesia that has been created by the anti-colonial struggle that has been elaborated so eloquently by President Sukarno, who has been at the forefront of the Third World Movement. The first thing that they try in Indonesia is to funnel money to a right-wing Muslim political party, hoping that will stop the Indonesian Communist Party from doing so well in elections. That does not work. In 1958, they foment and then participate in a civil war, sending US pilots to drop bombs on Indonesian civilians, killing citizens, all the while telling the Indonesian government that they are not involved in the civil war. The Indonesian left is loudly proclaiming that they are. The Indonesian left is proved correct when a CIA pilot crash lands and is identified as an American in 1958. And this attempt is now out the window. They have to come up with something else. So from 1958 to 1965, the Indonesian military, instead of being confronted at war by the United States government, is brought to the United States for training. And the United States develops very close relationships with the United States, with the Indonesian military, I believe sort of bringing a Latin American script to the Indonesian context. This is something that had been happening in Latin America for a very long time, forming close relationships with military officers and really building a deep friendship so that if needed, the military could be called upon to act in accordance with US interests and often in accordance with their own interests too. The field of incentives was shaped to allow for those two things to overlap. So with the death of John F. Kennedy in the beginning of the Johnson administration in the early 60s, policy shifts again towards Indonesia. They bring in an ambassador, which is widely believed in Indonesia to be someone that is in charge of carrying out regime change. Behind the scenes, in ways we still do not fully understand because of the files have not been declassified, MI6 and CIA begin to agitate for a clash between the very well-armed Indonesian military and the unarmed but very popular Indonesian Communist Party, knowing very well what happens when there is a clash between an armed and an unarmed group, in ways which are still much mysterious because the relevant parties will not tell us what they were doing at the time. This clash does come about in 1965. And immediately a general named Suharto in Indonesia seizes power, shuts down all communications outlets which the military does not control. And with the assistance of media in the United States and Britain and Australia and the United States government and the British government, spreads a propaganda story blaming the Indonesian Communist Party, which is now between 25 and 30% of the country, as I said, would have won elections if they were carried out, blames them for horrible crimes which never took place, including the castration and torture of Indonesian generals in a satanic, tantric, Marxist orgy. This propaganda story, spread with the help of Western powers, is used to justify rounding up approximately 2 million people. We don't know exactly the numbers because the international community has never been able to carry out a real investigation of what happens next. Indonesia certainly didn't, and the United States did not either. Around 2 million people are taken into jail. Communists accuse communists, ethnic Chinese, labor organizers, feminists, people in charge of cultural organizations. Often, many of the people that I met told me that they went into prison believing that things were going to be fine. They were just going to explain that they had nothing to do with whatever was going on in Jakarta. I'd be happy to talk to the police. It was people that were in the Communist Party associated with it, felt that they were fully legal members of society. They had nothing to worry about. They did have something to worry about, very tragically. Over the next few months, about 1 million of these people, perhaps more, perhaps less, were taken out of prison at night or taken somewhere secret and executed, thrown in rivers, discarded. Another 1 million stayed in concentration camps for people to be held specifically as a result of their political beliefs. In this moment, with 1 million people in jail for their political beliefs and bodies floating through the rivers of Indonesia, the United States government brings Suharto into the quote unquote free world. US business opens for Indonesia, and Suharto becomes one of the most important allies of the United States in the Cold War. Now, although we've forgotten about this event in the English-speaking world, people that were paying attention at the time, people that were paying attention to the Cold War at the time, understood that this was a very big deal. This was the most important unarmed socialist party, perhaps in human history. This is the president who has been at the forefront of the Third World Movement, and basically, overnight, this country is flipped into the pro-Western anti-communist camp, and the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, has been eliminated. Now, for right-wing movements around the world, for allies of the United States, for potential allies of the United States, this was seen as something that could be copied. This was seen as something that worked, that could be perhaps implemented in their own countries. And if it were implemented, they would get the support of the United States government. So the first explicit instantiation of the word Jakarta to signify the mass murder of communists or accused communists comes in Chile during the administration of democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. Far-right groups, many of which have been funded by the United States, are carrying out a number of terror campaigns on the streets of Santiago. And one of them is to write on the walls of the street or to send out postcards to leftists or government employees or people accused of being leftists, Jakarta or Jakarta is coming. And the message, again, was very clear for those that were paying attention. The message was, we're going to kill you, just like the Indonesians killed their leftists. On September 11th, 1973, very tragically, Jakarta did come to Chile. Pinochet takes power after the US successfully are able to assist in a coup d'etat in that country. Soon after, Chile, Brazil, and many other countries in South America form Operation Condor, as Rigoberta mentioned. Operation Condor countries throughout the 70s kill tens of thousands of people. And then in the 1980s, when Central America becomes the perceived problem spot for the United States, Operation Condor countries move into Central America and give tips on how to do the same thing. And across my, and this brings us back, of course, to precisely Rigoberta's own powerful story. But just to summarize, I found that across the entire Cold War, there were at least 22 countries in which the intentional mass murder of leftists or accused leftists was carried out, and that this was one of many methods used in the Cold War that really shaped the type of world that we got after it ended. So thank you for the opportunity to provide that context, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Vincent Bevins. I hope that everyone reads your book, as well as the Nobel Peace Laureate Rigoberta Menchu's book, I, Rigoberta Menchu. Now, Vincent, I wanted to follow up with a question and then turn to Rigoberta. And my question to you is the series of coups you talk about in the world that the US was integral to. 1953, you have Iran, and you have the US involved also at the behest of Anglo-Iranian oil, right? That becomes as the predecessor to British Petroleum, which is BP. You have Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, who comes with armfuls or suitcases full of cash, overthrows the democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, 53. But Kermit Roosevelt refuses to do the bidding for the United States in 1954 of Guatemala, the overthrow of Guatemala. And I wanted to ask you, as we set the scene to go back to Rigoberta, about that coup, about the Secretary of State at the time, the corporate lawyer, John Foster Dulles, and his brother, Allen Dulles, who was head of the CIA. John Foster Dulles had represented as a corporate lawyer United Fruit. And many say that the democratically elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz, was overthrown by the United States on behalf of United Fruit. Do you share that analysis?
Yeah, that's a simple, to put it very simply, that I think that works. Yes. I think it's really interesting that you brought up Kermit Roosevelt's hesitance to be involved in 1954. I have the quote in the book, but it's quite telling, because you get this kind of thing happening throughout the Cold War. He says something like, after going through everything that has happened in Iran, he says something like, if the people don't want it, it's never going to work out, right? Like, if you try to shove something on the people of a country, you're going to get chaos afterwards. And you do get chaos afterwards in Guatemala. You do not have a stable government established by the coup of 1954. You have violence is immediately requested at the behest of the United States government. They ask the new regime to kill people. And United Fruit is incredibly influential in generating particular types of media coverage in the United States and lobbying the US government, both of which I think contributed to the ultimate decision taken by the United States government. I don't think they weren't pressing all the buttons. I think they really they had a lot of influence in the media. They brought journalists out. They showed them a particular side of the story. They were active in Washington, D.C. They had close friendships with the government. So yeah, I do think it's right to say that United Fruit pushed the United States government towards backing a coup in Guatemala. Wasn't the only reason they did it, but that simple version of the story I do think is accurate.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us back to Rigoberta Menchu. If you can talk about that history and your role, your seminal lawsuit to force accountability, talk about who you sued, Rigoberta, and talk more concretely about on the ground the terror that your family faced right through to 1980, when your father was burned to death with a number of others at the Spanish embassy in Guatemala. Who was responsible for that?
Bueno, es
Well,
terrible pensar.
it's terrible to think that to massively destroy something, you have to strategize, right? You have to build a doctrine in order to then use it. And that's what happened in the whole world, and in Latin America in particular. Violence didn't happen just because we had like some evil soldiers, criminals that got together and said, let's kill these people. No, they were obeying a plan against the so-called insurgents in Guatemala. And this plan started by the beheading of the social movement. They thought they had to behead the social organizers in order to have like the free way to, or a free way to carry out their plan. And what was in play were the territories that were in the hands of the indigenous peoples, right? The natural resources, the territory, the land itself, mineral resources. What they wanted was to possess all of this richness, all of these resources, this wealth. And this is why the violence focused on indigenous people, because indigenous peoples had a system, an ancestral system that was their own. And instead of learning their language or recognizing their system, that ancestral system, they thought they had to get them in line, right? Like get them to use the traditional politics that was foreign to these indigenous peoples. My father was a peasant and an organizer and activist who tried to improve the use of land, the community, and our territory, our land that is called Cloud Forest. And they thought they had to do away with him, with my father, because I think there are people also at a local level that were in favor of that destruction, massive destruction of indigenous peoples. If the typification of this crime of oppression, of killing, but also of ethnocide, if that existed at the time, so many atrocities wouldn't have happened. I think there were 446 massacres, according to the United Nations. More than 200,000 victims, amongst them children, pregnant women, and the methods for their killing. You know, for instance, they used women, they accused them within this armed conflict, right? Women have always been used in wars, but they used them as symbols of terror so that other women and men start thinking about what may happen to them, what may happen to their wives, to their children, if they said something out of sync with the discourse, right? Here it was brutal, and there's proof of it. We started documenting. We weren't only witnesses of these crimes, right? Because these crimes were committed against our families. You know, like the case of my mom, they said she was tortured, she's in a mass grave. The bodies were thrown on a hill. There's like a legend around the figure of my mother, for instance, and we couldn't think about what was real because there were so many testimonies. The criminalization of the women leaders is something that really happened. And and the women were just left in these mass burial graves. And I don't doubt that my mom isn't one of those. But that happened, that thing that happened left a print, like a footprint or something that stays here in the now and that will be there in the future. Still in Guatemala, you can be accused of subversion, of being a communist. That in the past was a crime that could cost you your life. And many people who lived my time, that could speak out were accused. I wasn't alone, thankfully. I had a lot of people who came with me in this journey, who helped me overcome the very delicate situation, the very difficult time of being who I was, right? And becoming human, because I could be full of vengeance, full of rancor, and I'm not. This, what is left after violence in Guatemala, thanks to Mayan spirituality, we are able to overcome that. And we dared go to a judge, before a judge that is not indigenous. They are like codes of justice and systems of justice that are foreign to us as indigenous peoples. And they've always told us that indigenous rights do not exist. Then how can you defend yourself before a judge that does not believe in you and your culture? But in a massacre in 1995, I was up against several colonels that were leading this massacre. And thanks to this trial that we got into, I went there with the witnesses from the community. We became researchers. Witnesses. We became lawyers. We started to understand how the penal system works, how the justice system works. We documented everything. We incorporated 12 Mayan languages in the process so that this would come to something, right? And also, I was part of the group that confronted the military charter, and that's not easy, right? Because I was a specialist in dialogue, in becoming intolerance, and that wasn't their language. And the gravest thing, the most important thing here is that the North American policy had a say into all of this. And we found that there were records of the people carrying out those killings in the American embassy. We found out later. And in the School of the Americas, that's testimony of many military men and women who graduated here in Guatemala. But I don't hate North Americans, right? I love people here in the United States. And I think people here in the United States, they can govern, they can regulate the role of their figures of authority, right? I think you can, you have a role in that, you have a say in that. In Guatemala, for instance, we have about 500 cases going on in 500 trials, right? Before judges. And we want to do away with amnesties from the past. Right now, there are only 5 cases that we got to win. The case of Rios Montt,
The former
hasn't been
president of Guatemala.
sentenced. It's a public audience. The case of the Spanish embassy, there's no sentence either, because the state doesn't want to assume the responsibility, but it's been there. there's the case of the Ishil trial, and there are some others that have prospered, that we've got a good, favorable sentence. And we do this because we have the truth on our sides.
Rigoberta, as you talk about having the truth on your side, what inspired you as a young woman? I mean, the fear, the horror before you. You were born in 1959. When you were about 20 years old, your younger brother was killed, followed by your father being killed. Talk about what made you decide to stand up when you knew the stakes, your mother disappeared, were so high. What was the turning point? Was there a turning point for you? I mean, we're speaking now at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. There are so many students just about your age at that time. What motivated you? After all that you faced and all that you lost in your family, why did you keep going?
Es muy difícil, muy difícil.
That's very difficult. It's very difficult to give advice. I just got out of Guatemala. I was sick. I was feeling horrible. But thanks to the nuns that took me in, that they helped me go into exile. And I went to exile like any other exiled, right? I lost everything like any other exile. I lost my connection with my family, with my sisters, with my community, and I was on survival mode. But the biggest thing for me maybe was the rage I had in me for what had happened to my family. I tried to silence that, but I couldn't. And I made a huge effort to speak that out. And as I spoke that out, I also tried to educate myself. And in doing all of that, in that process is where I finally got to be awarded the Nobel Prize. But you know, this is a struggle for life. But I think in those years, in which we didn't think about being in the struggle for 1 week, 2 weeks, we didn't believe in personal time. We just wanted to get those stories out, to speak out. My indigenous brothers and sisters here in the United States, they helped me a lot to be able to speak at churches, in solidarity groups with other defenders of human rights, the grandmas of Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, the comadres in Salvador. I got associated with others that were in similar situations. This was like a common cause. And I think my ancestors, my Mayan ancestors, they illuminated me. I believe in them. I believe in them very much. And I think they laid out this path for me. And I think it's about attitude. I think if we stay as victims, if we think of ourselves as victims, we can't take a stance against what we're fighting against, right? What we're struggling against. And I think also opportunity is important. I was given the opportunity to share spaces and speak out. And I think also the academia, right? I had the chance to become a professor in the Autonomous University in Mexico, to become a professor of law, to specialize in international law, to talk about the self-determination of people, of the peoples, right, etc., etc. To bring into all of that indigenous ideals. And I think through all of those channels, me and other people, we were able to build a common agenda. I think today I focus on the common struggle of victims, of common struggle of witnesses, of everybody who have held through their academic knowledge the people who are struggling. And I want to say thank you to the system who's able to listen to a truth, even if it's not codified, right? Let's say. And I think having the attitude to find solutions is very important.
I want to encourage people to send in your questions and chat. I wanted to ask Vincent Bevins, follow up on a point that Rigoberta Menchú made about the training of soldiers at Fort Benning. I mean, it's so significant that although there were a number of trials in Guatemala holding Guatemalans accountable, where is the accountability for the backers of the murderous death squads and the paramilitary death squads in Guatemala, for example? Or, for example, the US role not only in toppling Sukarno, bring us Suharto, but moving on to Indonesia's invasion of East Timor and killing off a third of the population. But with Guatemala, it's so clear the line, not to mention your work in Brazil, the accountability for the American government. And if you can start off by talking about the role of Fort Benning, as one of the people in the audience asks, were they carrying out the Jakarta method there?
So, in the case of Indonesia, which is unique in the number of people killed, it is also unique in that even in Indonesia, there has been no admission to the victims that what happened to them was in any way wrong. The official story is still to this day that they deserved what happened to them. They're suffering. The survivors still face the stigma that was placed upon them in 1965. So there has not even been any kind of accountability for the people that admit to having carried out mass murder in Indonesia in 1965. Now, when it comes to the question of the United States, unfortunately, it seems to be that the position of the hegemon, the superpower in the global system, is that you're not held accountable for anything, right? I mean, it is incredibly rare in the history of the United States government since 1945 that anybody at the high levels of the US government is held accountable for crimes committed against people of the global South. There are some exceptions for crimes committed within the US government, violations of norms. But it seems to be that is what it is to be the hegemon. And in the case, responding more directly to that question, whether or not Fort Benning was doing the Jakarta method, in the case of Indonesia, we know that the US government and its officials were actively encouraging the murder of communists and people accused of being communists. In one case, someone from the US government admitted to passing lists of people to be killed in Indonesia, so those names could be crossed off and passed back to the United States government. We know that the Indonesian military was doing it because they believed that the United States government wanted them to. We know that the particular tactics that were used in Indonesia came to Latin America, including Guatemala, directly afterwards, including the use of disappearances, the kind of terror tactic that not only takes someone's life, but leaves their family and friends in a state of confusion about what has happened. This moves from Asia to Guatemala and Venezuela in 1966, and we know that there are US officials that also were transferred in that exact same way. So the fingerprints of the United States government in many of these cases, as I said, there's 22 overall. In some cases, the United States government is clearly participating and assisting. In other cases, they're providing indirect support. In other cases, the perpetrators seem to be doing it because they know that they'll get away with it or be encouraged or be rewarded for having done so. But even in the cases where it's very clear that the United States government has been helping to carry out mass murder, there's no kind of accountability. And I think that says more about the nature of the global system that has been established precisely by this type of global intervention than it does about the amount of evidence we have, because the evidence is clear. It's the problem is with the very nature of international law within the system established by US hegemony since 1945.
And I'll follow up with another question from the audience. What's the connection between state crimes and the problems Guatemalans currently face, such as gang violence and poverty? And what would reparations look like for survivors of state violence? And let me add to that question, how would you link what happened in 1954, the US-backed overthrow of the democratically elected leader Arbenz, to the terror of the 1980s, the decimation of the Mayan population, like the family of Rigoberta Menchú, to the issue of migration and the Northern Triangle, the number of people who are fleeing these countries and their violence, the link from the US through, the through line.
Is that for me or for Rigoberta?
For you, and then I'll ask Rigoberta.
Oh yes, so absolutely. So the question of how life in Guatemala and the rest of Central America would be different if it were not for these interventions is so difficult, because it is impossible to imagine how many things would have gone differently if it were not for this particular type of intervention that started in the late 40s and 1950s. Everything would be different. I mean, everything that we can understand about the development trajectories taken by Central American countries in the last 60 years is somehow indirectly a consequence of US intervention. Specifically in the case of Guatemala, you mentioned that Kermit Roosevelt was reticent about carrying out the coup, another coup, because he said this kind of thing wouldn't work if the people didn't want it. And in the case of Guatemala, you immediately did get chaos, which essentially is unbroken. I mean, you get the chaos changes in form, you get the different types of political problems from 1954 to the end of the Civil War. But there is basically unbroken link between what happens in 1954 all the way to the mass murder of the 1980s, which, as we both mentioned, goes up into the hundreds of thousands in Guatemala. Guatemala is the worst case behind Indonesia in terms of absolute numbers. And I'm sure she'll be able to talk about this too, but in every community that I visited in the Guatemalan highlands that had been decimated by the intentional mass murder in the 1980s, the residents that were there told me that they had friends or family in the United States, that they had people that had to go, not because they wanted to, but because the local economic opportunities had been decimated by the Civil War, because the human population had been decimated, and this was a way to get some money back into the community. So I think that you could draw a very clear line from 1954 all the way to the mass murder of the 80s, and then directly to the large waves of migration coming from Central America to the United States ever since then.
And let me put the question of reparations to Rigoberta. The whole issue of what reparations would look like for their survivors of state violence. What would you like to see, Rigoberta, happen at this point?
Yo creo que
Well,
actualmente
I think that right now the reconciliation would be to have no more interventions, right? At a local level, at a regional level, to keep these same crimes from happening, and to have a recognition of the past, and to have young people recognize and get to know what happened, not to hide the past. In Guatemala, we've had a lot of discussion around around discrediting the violence of the past. We've suffered many attacks saying that, we're full of vengeance, that we shouldn't insist in the past, that we should just get over it, leave the past where it is. They've tried to keep us from doing what we do, right? But we should stop seeing that only as past, because there are many places where we see that happening today, narco traffic, organized crime, those organizations still carry out disappearances. There's still torture going on. And those types of crimes are typified now, right, as crimes against humanity. There's also many cases of femicide, hatred against women, racism, discrimination. I think if we didn't stop the development of the people in Latin America, we wouldn't be seeing today the amount of racism and discrimination that we're witnessing today. So I think there's like a mental backlog in a way in our people that is caused by the invasions, the armed conflict. It is a big thing to carry, and that it has made our life very painful for me and for the generations that came after me. But I think the new generations have the opportunity to not to forget the past, but still to base their and because of that, base their lives in right decisions. But I think there's still people who are very sick in the world. You know, extreme poverty, for instance, is also something that keeps happening today in conflict areas, because these areas were like labs for them. The communities were laboratories for horror. The patrols of self-defense, civil self-defense, they still control different areas in the country. So it's not that we've ended, right? That this hasn't stopped. We still see these things happening. There are corporate mafias that are using this, and there's impunity also. In Guatemala, we see impunity coming on strong. There are still attacks against community leaders. There's criminalization of the struggle for the land, of the struggle carried out by social leaders. And I think the impunity of all the, that all of this is able to enjoy is something that we still carry from the past. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes. Let me ask this question. It's from a national anarchist mutual aid organization, the Trans Asylum Seeker Support Network. How can US-based grassroots organizations best build solidarity with and for the resistance struggles of Indigenous people, of Indigenous Mayans, anti-imperialist struggles around the global South? And that question was repeated in different ways by a number of people, how American students, for example, can best show support. Let's ask both of you, starting with Rigoberta Menchú.
Bueno, yo pienso que
Well, I think our flag of struggle for life, it wasn't only because we're lucky to have a story, right? And to be a witness and be in the main characters in what happened to us, but also we associated ourselves, we got together with others in order to fight. And I think that something that we got from the Cold War is that the firm conviction that diversity is what the best thing we have in humanity, right? All kinds of diversity, ethnic diversity, the diversity of peoples, cultural diversity, the fight for the self-determination, the struggle against the intervention of colonialism, and the awareness and bringing awareness throughout the world to say that we are here for a while and that we have to do the best we can during our time without trying to do everything, because there's a little bit for everyone to do, right? I think that people who committed crimes against humanity, you know, thankfully they're gone. They are gone from this earth. And they're not going to last forever as a bad example. And they shouldn't have done that. Like, they could have left a wonderful part of history for humanity. So I think time is also, in a way, like recycling. So I don't have to say that I'm part of diversity. Diversity is something you exercise. You exercise it in your own way. I have my spiritual strength. I have my Mayan identity. I have my own language. I admire this ancestral science of the Mayans through the calendars, through the exercise of ancestral spirituality. And I think that's what we should all do, to use our identity to make a better world that is more inclusive, that is more just, that is less racist, less phobic in all ways, less extreme. And I think we're getting there. And I know we're going through serious times, right? With a lot of problems. There's a lack of education. There's many problems with migration. Policies keep being very exclusive. We don't have the same rights before the law or in society or when it comes to healthcare. But I think we've come a long way. And I think we should hope for a better world. We're making it. We're building it with our example, with our own example, with what we do every day.
And Vincent, if you can expand on, I want to combine two questions. This issue of the documentation of solidarity struggles and the importance of their role in taking on state terror. And also a question about history education. Why is the history of US state terror not taught in schools?
Yeah, so just to add quickly to what she said, I agree with everything. It's very important to be in touch with and support whatever causes around the world that you also believe in. And I think an easy way to answer that question is to listen to what the actual indigenous groups say that they need, whatever that may be. In the last few months, I've done some work with either the APIB, the Associação de Povos Indígenas do Brasil, APIB, or Univaja in Brazil. These are both indigenous-led groups. Univaja having spent a lot of resources tracking down the body of my friend Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira, who's working with indigenous people in the Amazon. They needed money, and they said, we need money. So then if you are in a position to just give money to indigenous groups doing important work, that is something that as citizens, if you're a citizen of the first world like I am, and you have the ability to do that, that helps. In the last few weeks, I tried to raise some for an organization in Indonesia, which just pays the basic costs of life of the survivors of 1965. It's Sekretariat Bersama 65, Sekber 65. I also I posted about that somewhere. But I mean, the basic answer is to, if you're learning about struggles around the world that you sympathize with, find out what they say that they need, because it varies, and often the best way to help is just to give them your money and let them decide what to do with it. The question of history education is a really important one as well. I think that if we do not, as Rigoberta said so eloquently at the very beginning, establish the truth of what has really happened, we're at real risk of not only doing damage, further damage to the victims, but of reproducing the types of violence that was so important to structuring the type of world that we live in now. So I think that we should push in every way possible to make sure that this history is uncovered, first of all, because we're not even done uncovering it, and that it remains taught to the next generation and broadcast around the world. As to why it is not taught enough, that is a question, I think, about the function of education in sort of an advanced capitalist society. There is some kind of a role to form a certain type of citizen, and the certain narratives get excluded, which are inconvenient to the powers that be. But that is something that is not a lost cause. You can push back against that as much as possible. You can fight that battle on the margins to get as much of the truth told as is possible. And I think that's really important work.
You know, it's really interesting to ask this question now. This isn't the topic of this conversation, but in this week of the mourning for Queen Elizabeth II, and all the, especially in the United States, extolling of the monarchy, the lack of education we have of the perspective from the colonies, from Jamaica, from Barbados, from Kenya, from Nigeria, from places like Antigua and Barbuda, how important the role of the media is in telling a story from all sides, and what colonialism means. And I'm wondering about that, Rigoberta Menchú, how you were able to harness the media, and if winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992 elevated your story to change the narrative about Guatemala. I mean, the reports done on the killings of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people in Guatemala, this wasn't equal, right? This wasn't two sides fighting a war. This was a mass slaughter in your country.
Muchas gracias por.
Thank you for this question. I'm not a star of the media. I'm not a media star. You know, it came to me in a way, having to struggle with a system that is very tough in Guatemala. It got to a point in which they only asked me about what happened with my pain, or with the pain, with the suffering, what happened with the victimaries. And they wanted to make me the voice of those big victim groups. And in that way, I had to shield myself from the media, because they didn't give me a space where I could tell the stories that I thought I needed to tell. I had to hide in a way. Thanks to technology, I really value social media. I really value them, because social media has allowed me to say what I wanted to say and not what others wanted me to say. And I think it's really important to sensibility. If we're sensible and sensitive, we're going to find our path. As long as we value life, we defend life, we value others, we value and defend the ways of living of others, the ways of thinking of others, then we would have created our own means of communication. Thankfully, the Mayans in Guatemala, we have 23 languages, and I only speak Quiché. I don't speak any of the others, and I speak Spanish, and that makes me very humble when it comes to understanding the pains of others, or how they want to forgive the past. It's not my place to say to forgive in the name of others. I have to ask them, what do they want to say and how do they want to forgive? They might have other ways of dealing with the past. They might not even want to forgive, you know? So I work very well with media. I love using social media, TikTok even. It's very important. It gives us, it provides us a huge reach, right? To reach people. And I think in the past we lived in silence, in solitude, right? And we were alone. And even if we found people who were solidary, right? And they gave us their hospitality, their love, but we couldn't reach the world as a whole. And that's why also the book was very important for me. It's a great ambassador of my story that helped me break the silence and that reach every corner in the world. And that's why I also value the written word. And I wish more people were able to read, to write. And, you know, even if it's just like children's books, films, videos, whatever, and on paper too. All of that is very important to preserve memory, history, the dignity of victims, and to teach and show and bring out there everything that builds collective memory. What happened in every community is not only the pain of one victim, it's a pain that is collective. And we work with that.
Dr. Menchu, a question from the audience. You mentioned how Mayan spirituality helped the Mayan people to overcome the aftermath of violence. Can you explain the specific beliefs that helped? And in general, what should an affected people do to address collective trauma?
Bueno, hay una parte de mi vida.
Well, there's a part of my life and my work that is exactly that, spirituality, right? Ancestral spirituality.
Construyendo sitios sagrados.
I've been building sacred spaces, altars, and also working with Mayan medicine that is related to physical health, but also to mental health, to clean the body, but also to clean the mind, using medicinal plants. They're like flower baths, baths with aromatic herbs. And I think us Mayans, we use also the sacred fire to purify our eyes, our minds. There's also silence and meditation to accompany others, to go with others, to be with the victims through their own ceremonies. We've done a lot of ceremonies, and I hope that the students in the University of Massachusetts may one day come to Guatemala and share with us one of our ancestral ceremonies. We have a Pashek Center that is 39 kilometers away from the city of Guatemala, where we do ceremonies with young people, with adults, with people who have lived something special, but also just people who are thankful for life. Not only the sick and the people in pain arrive to our Mayan spirituality, people who are illuminated come to us too. So I practice that, I exercise that. And it's beautiful having your own spirituality. It's like having time, your own time, so that you can set the negative things, the bad things aside, or put them in their right place, and then you can flower inside. And that will help you do everything you can do on Earth. I have like a mission on Earth, and I'm willing to work towards that goal. And that's what we do. You know, I've been involved in trials, I've done research, I've been a speaker, I've been a facilitator in negotiations, but also I have the opportunity to develop my spirituality. And I want to be a teacher of teachers. That's my mission within my spirituality. It's really important to become a teacher of teachers, a master of masters.
I want to thank you both so much for being part of this discussion. And Rigoberta Menchu, your bravery is immeasurable and inspires awe in everyone who hears you and reads your story. And I hope everyone will read Rigoberta's book that she was just talking about, I, Rigoberta Menchu. What a remarkable life story Rigoberta has led and continues to lead. And I want to also encourage everyone to read Vincent's book, a very important book about US imperialism and imperialism in general in the world. His book called The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder Program that Shaped Our World. That does it for the first event of the Feinberg series, Confronting Empire, a year-long series from the University of Massachusetts, the UMass Amherst History Department, and the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy, and partners bringing together scholars, journalists, and activists, exploring global histories of US imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance. You can register for further events on their website, umass.edu/Feinberg, Feinberg. And if you want to continue to hear the stories of grassroots activists and their immeasurable bravery around the world, democracynow.org is a great place to go for a daily grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour across the week, hearing people telling their own stories as we go to where the silence is. Big thank you to the organizers of this event. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you to Vincent and Dr. Rigoberta Menchú-Tun.